Okay, this is a video presentation for Chapter 6 of the Criminological Theory book. We're going to continue the discussion of control theory, and even though the book goes into a lot of detail on some minor theories out there that you should be familiar with, I'm going to spend our time here talking mostly about really the primary theories in this area that are still used in research today. The theorist who is most commonly associated with control theory is Travis Hirschi, and his theories have pretty much dominated the control theory area for at least 3 or 4 decades. And some of the things that are appealing about his theories is, you see these lists here. One is that they're very what we call parsimonious theories. The word parsimonious means explaining the most possible with the fewest possible variables. So they're very simple theories. They don't have a lot of complexity to them really, but they are very powerful and actually do explain quite a bit of what we're trying to explain in terms of criminal behavior and juvenile delinquency. Hirschi is kind of a combative person, and he's kind of a controversial figure in criminology. That's one reason his theories have been so well noted. Hirschi likes to make really broad sweeping claims. His theories are, he claims, explain everything, all crime, everywhere, for everybody. And so when you make that kind of a claim, it's going to attract a lot of attention because people are going to want to disprove you. But Hirschi really is for pitting theories against each other, seeing which one is the best. And he says that the one that is not the best, you just throw it out. Now that's not usually what we do, but that's his argument. Like I said, Hirschi has presented theories that he claims are general, meaning they explain all crime across all types of people and across all kinds of environments. He has very little interest in talking about the differences between races, social class, or even genders, because he would say that none of that really matters. That yes, those variables are correlated with certain outcomes, but that those are not causal in terms of predicting someone's involvement in crime. So he would say that these are just kind of background factors that we might look at, but that they aren't important in terms of predicting crime. So now again, whether or not that's true is another matter, but that is his argument, so keep that in mind. Hirschi has 2 primary theories that have dominated the control perspective for a long time. Social bond theory and self-control theory, or low self-control theory sometimes it's called. His self-control theory was actually published under the name The General Theory of Crime, and so you will see it referred to under that name as well. But most people just call it self-control theory or low self-control theory. But these 2 theories are very important in criminology. They explain a lot, and they're very compelling, so we're going to talk about those. Looking at Hirschi's first theory, and this is a theory he developed back in the 1960s or so, it was social bond theory, and it was intended to explain juvenile delinquency. And the main premise of this theory is that when social bonds are weak or absent, then delinquency would occur. And this is kind of a challenge to Sutherland's differential association and Merton's strain theory. Because if you think about it, Sutherland's theory said, well, criminal behavior is learned, and so we learn it from other people, and that's why we do it. Merton said, well, it's this strain, this economic strain that causes people to commit crime. Hirschi said that's not the case, that we don't learn it, that's not induced by strain, it's just crime happens when social bonds are weak. And so when we talk about social bonds, what we're really talking about is external controls on our behavior, looking at the way society kind of weighs upon us to behave the way that we should. So what Hirschi said is that what makes offenders different from non-offenders are just the factors that restrain people from acting on their wayward impulses. And these social bonds are the social controls that would regulate how often or if we would engage at all in criminal behavior. So looking at this idea of social control, essentially the assumption about human nature that Hirschi uses is that we are all seekers of pleasure. We want the fastest gratification we can get in the easiest possible way, and that is just human nature. And that nature has to be controlled, and it's these external forces, he says in this theory, that control it. So if you look, it has a little bit of the rational choice model to it, in that Hirschi would say that each criminal act has benefits and consequences to it. But Hirschi kind of assumed that all people saw the same benefits in committing crime. And so the assumption is that all people are pretty much equally motivated to offend. There's not really anything different about an offender versus a non-offender, except for the level of social control that they experience that regulates their behavior. So this slide here says what I just said, that the variation in the strength of social control is what explains the variation in the participation in crime. So in emphasizing social control, what Hirschi really was talking about is our ties to conventional society, and this is what he called social bonds. And so it was this variation in the strength of social bonds that explains this variation in crime. And the stronger the bond is, Hirschi would argue, the less likely you are to commit crime. So we've talked a lot about these social bonds in general. We're going to get a little more specific about what these bonds actually are and what they mean. What you see here is a list of the 4 social bonds that Hirschi identified in his social bond theory. And that little inset there is just a chart from your book that talks about the same thing. But the 4 social bonds identified by Hirschi are attachment, commitment, involvement, and belief. So we'll have to now define what these are. But just going through a brief definition here from your chart. Attachment is the emotional closeness to others, especially your parents. Commitment talks about aspiration to goals, your commitment to the legitimate goals of society. Involvement is talking about the amount of participation a person has in constructive, pro-social types of activities. The basic idea here is that if you are busy doing pro-social things, you don't have time to go out and commit crime. So that's what that's talking about. Belief is talking about a person's acceptance of society's goals and moral norms as legitimate, that you believe that that is the right way to live your life. So we'll go a little bit more into detail on these. So again, looking at the first social bond of attachment, what Hirschi was talking about here is the emotional closeness that a youth has to adults. And parents were identified as being the key figures that, the stronger a child is attached emotionally to their parents, and they want to please them and all of that, then the less likely they are going to be to do things that would make the parents unhappy. Now, it doesn't have to be parents. I mean, if you were raised by grandparents or whatever, then it could be some figure like that as well. It could also be teachers, religious leaders, anybody that a child looks up to that they try to model after. But parents were kind of identified as the key figures, and if the parents are not around, then there are certainly others that can step in to fill that role. But the social bond of attachment works the same either way. In looking at the effect that parents have, there's what we call direct control and indirect control. Direct control is when you're in your parents' home, they're right there in front of you, and they're telling you what they want you to do, and because they're your parents and you love them, you do it. So they're right there, they're directly controlling you, and that's what that means. But what was more important for social bond theory is what we call indirect control. And that's one of the things that's important about this social bond of attachment, is that the more attached you are to your parents, and the more you want to please them, the more likely you are to behave well even when they're not around, because you know they're going to find out. And so even though your parents might not be, and I'm saying parents, but again, it could be any interested adult, but even if your parents aren't around, they're what we call psychologically present, because you know that if you do something that they don't approve of, that might go poorly for you later, and they would be unhappy, and all of that. So that's one of the keys to this social bond of attachment, is it's not so much that parents are there telling you what to do. It's that because you have this attachment to your parents, you want to please them and behave well even when they're not physically present. So in looking at the social bond of commitment, the phrase you see used with this most frequently is what we call someone's stake in conformity. And all this really means is, how much do you have to lose by engaging in bad behavior? Someone who is maybe going to college and has a scholarship and has a job, maybe a boyfriend or girlfriend, husband or wife, and kids, you have a lot to lose probably by getting arrested and going to jail. So this idea is that the higher your stake in conformity is, the more you have to lose by engaging in bad behavior, the less likely it is that you'll actually do that. So this is kind of a rational component of the social bond theory, because it involves kind of weighing, costs and benefits, and well, if I do this, what will I lose versus what will I gain? And so really what Hirschi argues here is that this high level of commitment, or this high stake in conformity, matters. Now, if you maybe on the opposite end of the scale, think about someone maybe who grew up in an economically depressed neighborhood, wasn't given the opportunity to really have a great education, maybe they can't find a job, and so someone like that probably doesn't feel like they have as much to lose by getting caught doing something wrong or illegal. So again, that kind of situation would be a situation Hirschi would argue would make it more likely that someone would be committing some kind of criminal acts. One of the things that needs to happen in order for this social bond of commitment to work, the person has to perceive this actual connection between being deviant and losing some of the things that they hold valuable. But if you think about it, just to kind of highlight how some theories differ on their assumptions, think about what strain theory had to say about the need to achieve economically. Strain theory essentially said that was one of the causes of delinquency, was this need to achieve. The social bond theory really kind of takes the opposite stance, that it's this commitment to this norm, this stake in conformity, and this desire to achieve that actually prevents delinquency. So we won't go into a lot of detail right now as to which one of those is more correct, but you need to recognize that different theories have competing assumptions, and that was one of the things Hirschi said we needed to examine, is to test the theories, to see which one was right. Is it actually right that the need to achieve prevents delinquency, or does it cause it? And so those are some questions you'll see asked about these theories. Moving forward now to the social bond of involvement. This one's pretty easy to understand. Really, when we talk about involvement, all it's talking about is how involved is a person in conventional pro-social activities. This is the old saying that idle hands are the devil's workshop. So if kids just aren't engaged in too many activities, they don't really have any structure to their day, it's just a lot more likely that they're going to do something delinquent. If someone is involved in a lot of activities, either with school or sports or family or whatever it happens to be, it's really just that there's no opportunity for delinquency to occur. And that's kind of an important aspect of this, that even if someone really wanted to commit a delinquent act, if they don't have the opportunity or the time to do it, then it's not going to happen. So that's really all there is to this one. I mean, this is not that difficult to understand, but this was a key social bond that Hirschi identified. The last social bond is belief. And when we say belief, what we're talking about is our voluntary consent and acceptance of the norms that society is telling us we need to live by. And that's really, all it is. And if, the higher degree we give of approval to the norms of society, then the more likely it is that we're going to follow along with them. If we don't agree with the norms of society and we don't think that the way they tell us to live is how we should live, and we don't need to get a job and we don't need to go to school, then the less likely we are to live by those rules. And Hirschi argued that this was one of the key things that would determine whether or not someone would engage in delinquent behavior. So looking at the chain of causation through these social bonds, is, as far as it relates to this bond of belief, attachment to parents and that concern that we have for getting their approval is kind of leads to this belief that the rules of society are binding on our conduct. So, if we didn't really care about pleasing anybody, then we really wouldn't have any reason to accept these rules of society. So, really, when you look at this social bond, the idea of morality, even though it's not specifically mentioned, is really kind of implicit in this idea, because this is kind of the extent to which we embrace the moral validity of the law and the moral standards that society is telling us that we need to live by. So looking again at how this theory might compete with some others, if you remember Akers from social learning theory, which was the extension of differential association theory, social learning argues that people offend because they are socialized and they learn to embrace these criminal beliefs. Hirschi would argue very strongly that any learning is necessary for people to commit crime. And it all goes back to his assumption about human nature. Remember, the assumption here is, in control theory, that people are naturally pleasure seekers. We always seek the easiest thing we can do for the most pleasure and the least pain in the easiest possible way. And so Hirschi says that because that is our nature, we don't need to be taught any of this stuff. We can figure it out pretty easily on our own. And so there really is, he would argue there is no learning that takes place, that these are just kind of things that are inborn in us. And what we need is to learn not to act that way. That's what he would say we need to learn. And so people, he would say, commit crime and delinquency because they aren't properly socialized into these conventional beliefs, and they don't develop these social bonds. So again, just recognize the differences between these theories. As far as the validity of social bond theory, it's actually pretty strong. I think it's, there are some inconsistent studies that have come out with studies on this, but one of the biggest problems is with measurement. Because how do you measure someone's commitment or belief or any of that? There are survey questions you can design to try and elicit those responses, but measuring those kinds of things is difficult. And so, it's tough to say, whether or not we've actually measured it correctly. And then even if we do, then we have to look at, okay, what's the relationship? But actually, generally speaking, the presence or absence of these social bonds does actually have a pretty significant relationship to delinquency as a child, and also for adult criminality as people get older. But what we do see in the research is that contrary to what Hirschi would argue, these social bonds are not the only cause of offending. Again, Hirschi was kind of controversial. He wanted to say that his theory explained everything. So what you have to recognize, you might see a lot of people bash social bond theory, but they're not so much bashing the theory as they are bashing Hirschi's claim that it explains everything all the time. It doesn't explain everything all the time, but the social bonds are actually pretty important in terms of predicting some of this criminal behavior. Just like any other theory, social bond theory has its limitations. Again, one is, we have this assumption that humans are naturally self-interested. And again, that may or may not be true. It's an assumption, and so we have to decide whether or not that's a good assumption or a bad assumption. The other weakness of the theory is Hirschi's failure to explore how social bonds are affected by other social forces. One of the key things that people bring up about this theory a lot is that Hirschi assumes that social bonds are always good, that a strong social bond will lead to less delinquency. Well, if you ignore some of these other social forces, then it's not that difficult to think about this. What about someone who has a strong social bond with a gang? They could have very strong social bonds, but that social bond is going to probably lead them down a delinquent path. So strong social bonds aren't always good. It really depends what you're bonded to, and the theory doesn't really explore that in any meaningful way. Another assumption that's probably pretty dubious, Hirschi argued that social bond theory applied equally across races, and that racial discrimination and unjust deprivation had no impact on anybody. That just seems on the face of it to be a pretty poor assumption, and I think it's been determined that it probably is. This study you see quoted here, Unever et al., assessing this question, found that racial discrimination actually is a pretty good predictor of delinquent involvement. Racial discrimination might not be directly causal for delinquent. Just because you're discriminated against doesn't mean you're going to be a criminal. But it may be indicative of other situations going on in your life that do lead you down that path, or just make it more likely that you will go down that path. So, again, there are a lot of things to consider here. This is kind of a simplistic evaluation of this. But you just need to realize, again, when we talk about Hirschi's theories, we said they were parsimonious. They try to explain a lot without bringing in a lot of complexity. So you can see an assumption like this, that discrimination doesn't matter, simplifies the theory. But he probably gave up some accuracy for that simplicity. So, keep those kind of things in mind. So now we'll look at Hirschi's second theory. Hirschi worked on social bond theory for a long time, and actually, even though a lot of researchers still like the theory today, and it's used a lot to explain a lot of things, Hirschi pretty much gave up on it. He just got frustrated with it. He didn't think it was working out as well as it should, and so he really just kind of abandoned it and moved on and created another theory. And he joined forces with a guy named Michael Gottfredson. And I've met Michael Gottfredson. He's a nice guy. And but Hirschi and Gottfredson joined forces, and they came up with a new theory, which is the official name of the theory was the general theory of crime, but most people refer to it as self-control theory or low self-control theory. The central premise of this theory is that self-control, and we'll talk about how they define that self-control is the key causal factor in whether or not someone is going to engage in crime at any point during their lifetime. So one of the first things you'll notice is that if you compare these theories, Hirschi really took the totally opposite approach, because social bond theory is all about external controls. But now with self-control theory, he's made the shift really to all internal controls, and so kind of the exact opposite approach that he took before. So looking at this self-control theory, we need to look at basically some of the premises that go along with it. Self-control was seen as kind of a trait, for lack of a better word, that is internalized early in life. And people that develop high self-control will probably not commit a lot of crime, and people who don't probably will. But what you have to keep in mind about this theory, and most theories actually, is that we're not talking about predicting that someone is definitely going to be a criminal. What we're talking about is likelihoods. High self-control people are less likely to engage in crime than people with low self-control. So you might have people with high self-control that commit crime, but Hirschi would just say that that's rare, and in fact we find that it is. People with low self-control would be expected to commit crimes at a higher rate, and we find that that is in fact the case as well. But not all low self-control people are criminals, and not all high self-control are non-criminals, so try not to get wrapped up in that kind of thinking. But here are the elements of this theory. First is that crime provides short-term gratification. Those who engage in crime also will tend to engage in what Hirschi called analogous behaviors. So analogous means similar to. And so what Hirschi argued in this theory is actually kind of interesting. He said the people that commit crimes will also be the same kinds of people that engage in other high-risk, short-term gratification activities. Things like excessive drinking, smoking, taking drugs, driving their cars too fast. And he actually predicted that people with low self-control would have a higher rate of automobile accidents. And a lot of research in that area has found that that actually is the case. I'll just tell you right now that the self-control theory is a theory that is very, very well documented, very well supported in the literature, and actually, although there are some parts of the theory that weren't quite right, the general premise of this idea of self-control has actually turned out to be a very, very strong one. So it's worth paying attention to this. Number three, Hirschi argued criminals don't plan their conduct, that a lot of crime is just kind of off the cuff, on the spur of the moment. Crimes are not specialized or sophisticated. This is kind of this idea of rejecting social learning, that this is not something that needs to be taught. There's no special skills involved. Most people can pretty much figure this out on their own. And then offenders fail in a lot of social domains. But again, going back to social bonding theory, where social bonding theory says these social domains are causal, Hirschi kind of changed his tune in self-control theory and said, well, people with low self-control fail in these social areas, but it's really the self-control that's causing that. The social bonds aren't really what's driving it. So it's really kind of a 180 for him. And then involvement in crime appears to be stable, that people who offend early in life pretty much continue to offend all through their life, maybe at a different rate. But people who are offenders as kids carry some level of offending all throughout their life, and so that's what we talked about. Is this crime engagement appeared to be a stable type of a characteristic. And then this last bullet point you see here, this is important because this is how self-control is defined. This is the definition of low self-control. People who are impulsive, insensitive to others, and when he said physical, what he meant was they preferred physical tasks over intellectual tasks. They are risk takers, they're short-sighted in their thinking, and they're nonverbal, meaning they prefer physical activity to talking and thinking types of activities. So that's the definition of low self-control, and those are the aspects that research has looked at as making up this construct of low self-control. Those 6 elements of low self-control comprise this single general propensity for crime that we call criminality. So however you rank on those 6 elements will determine your potential for committing crime. The problem of self-control is the differential tendency, just meaning that different people react differently they have this differential tendency to avoid criminal acts regardless of the circumstances that they find themselves in. There are people with low self-control who, because of circumstances, find that they're able to withstand crime. There are people with high self-control in circumstances who can't. And so we have to try and explain this differential tendency of people to engage in crime regardless of their circumstances or their levels of self-control. One of the important things about self-control theory is that Hirschi argued we need to make a differentiation between crime and criminality. Crime is the act. Criminality is the propensity a person has to engage in those acts. So crime can only occur if an opportunity exists to actually engage in the conduct. And we saw that in social bond theory as well with involvement, that if there's no opportunity, it doesn't really matter then what your level of self-control is or anything else, because without an opportunity it's not going to happen. But self-control theory and Hirschi essentially argued that crime opportunities are everywhere, that they're constantly available to all of us. That there is no unique characteristic of a crime that causes it to only crop up in certain circumstances. So what he argued is that because of individual differences in this propensity to resist committing a crime, this is what explains the variation in participation in crime. Because again, so in thinking this through logically, the opportunity to commit crime is everywhere all the time. Now again, this is an assumption. You have to decide whether it's a good or bad assumption. But if you assume crime is available to all of us all the time, then Hirschi says that it's this self-control trait is what explains why some people will commit a crime and others won't. If you think about it, let's say you walk up to the QT and there's a car with nobody in it in the parking lot and the engine's running and the car's unlocked. Well, some people see that as an opportunity to steal a car. Others might see that same opportunity but think, that's not a good idea, I'm not going to do it. Others, of course, won't resist. They'll jump in the car and leave. So Hirschi would say that the difference between the person who gets in the car and takes off and the one who doesn't is low versus high self-control. So now just to kind of boil this down a little bit, essentially the lower the level of self-control a person has, the higher the level of crime or other deviant behaviors that they're going to engage in. One of the key arguments of self-control theory was that a person's level of self-control was stable across the life course. That once it was set, and Hirschi argued that your self-control was pretty much set by the time you were 7 or 8 years old, that then stayed with you for your entire life. Now, I will tell you that a lot of research has been done on that proposition, and it has turned out really to not be true. Your level of self-control can actually vary over your lifetime, depending on the circumstances you find yourself in and the types of things you do. But you need to know that was a key argument of the theory initially, that the self-control was stable across your lifetime and it really never changed. So again, like I told you earlier, this concept of self-control has actually been shown to be highly correlated with criminal activity. And so now we need to ask the question, well, where does it come from? Then how do we develop self-control? Why do some have high and some have low? Hirschi argued that the origin of self-control was early in life because those are your most formative years. And again, by the time about age 7 or 8, he argued that it was pretty much set. And self-control was hypothesized by Hirschi to be primarily a product of parenting practices. And essentially what he said is that in order to instill self-control in children, parents need to monitor their children, recognize deviant behavior when it occurs, and then punish them to correct the misconduct so that it doesn't happen again. And it was through this mechanism that Hirschi and Gottfredson argued that self-control would be instilled. And there is some research that's been done on this, and much like a lot of other things we talk about, it has been found that parenting is an important predictor of a child's self-control, but it's probably not the only source of self-control. There are probably others, like what happens at school, what happens in churches and religious types of things. So parents are an important source of self-control, but probably not the only source of self-control. I've already talked about this a little bit, but just kind of wrapping this up a little bit, talking about self-control theory in general. There has been a lot of research done on this theory, and Gottfredson and Hirschi's claims that this was a general theory, immediately led everybody to want to disprove them. And so, what we've found is that it's probably not a general theory. It doesn't predict all crime everywhere all the time, but it actually has emerged as being probably one of the most important predictors of crime that we have found in criminology so far. So it really is a very successful theory in that aspect. In fact, you really can't do research anymore on crime without taking self-control into account, because if you don't account for it, you just won't get your study published, because it's well known that self-control is an important predictor of crime. So, but keep in mind that just because self-control explains a lot of variation in criminal involvement, and it is an important predictor, it doesn't mean that things identified by other theories are unimportant. There are good things from a lot of different theories, and we can pull in ideas from a lot of sources. But again, you also have to recognize that some of these theories compete and have different assumptions, and sometimes it's difficult to bring them all together in a way that's coherent. So looking at some more findings about self-control theory, like I said earlier, it's unlikely that individual differences in self-control are always stable. They actually do tend to change over the life course. Self-control is not strongly related to all types of crimes. Some people have highlighted white-collar crime as being kind of a problematic area. Because white-collar crime tends to be committed by people of high station in society, or higher station anyway, and they've had to exert some level of self-control probably to get where they are in a job where they had access to some ability to commit a crime. But I know that Hirschi's response to that is that again, someone with high self-control would just be committing crime would be more rare, and in fact, white-collar crime at those kind of levels is actually pretty rare, so that's their response to it. Not everybody buys that. The origins of self-control, like I said already, go beyond parenting. Parenting is an important predictor, but we also have to look at the impact of school socialization, neighborhood conditions. There are some biological factors that come into play. If someone has ADHD, that's a diagnosis that is almost entirely equal to low self-control. So there might be a biological factor there that needs to be taken into account. Comparing this to social bond theory, and I've done a little bit of this already, self-control theory really argues that social bonds have no influence on criminal behavior. Hirschi and Gottfredson say this is a spurious relationship. And if you have had statistics, you'll know what the word spurious means, but if not, I'll explain it. A spurious relationship is one that looks like it's real, but it's really not. So going back to social bonding theory, they argued that this attachment, involvement, belief, and all that, that was causal with crime. Now, we do see a relationship between those social bonds and crime, but Hirschi says it's spurious, meaning that it's not real, that it's really this other aspect of low self-control that wasn't measured before that is really the driving force behind the criminal behavior. That social bonds really are just kind of a result of your low self-control, and it's really the low self-control that is also driving your criminal involvement. So to explain this a little bit better, Hirschi would say that instead of social bonds causing crime, low self-control is causing poor social bonds, and then low self-control is also causing crime. So that's this relationship between social bonds and crime. They're correlated, but they're not causal, according to Hirschi. And so the self-control theory would essentially say that children with high self-control are more likely to be attached to parents and avoid delinquency. So again, it's this kind of underlying factor that's driving this, not so much the social bond itself. So you can see here that Hirschi changed his mind over the years. He argued very strongly that social bonds were the main determinant of crime initially, but later, as they developed self-control theory, he and Gottfredson came to believe that social bonds were just another manifestation of a person's level of self-control, and that there was no independent causal relationship between social bonds and criminal behavior. Now the question is, what kind of policy implications would we derive from control theories? Essentially, what control theory argues is that we need policies that foster the integration of people into the dominant social order. And really, they would say that policies of isolation and punishment, like prison, are counterproductive, because instead of drawing people into mainstream society, you're pushing them further out. Control theory has really fostered a lot of early intervention programs. One of the most popular ones is called Head Start. It's a pre-K program funded by the federal government. That program finds a lot of its origins in control theory, and it's actually one of the more successful early intervention programs that I'm aware of. But the early interventions that are usually recommended by control theory types of findings are interventions in terms of parenting, parenting classes, help people to learn how to be effective parents and get their kids out of delinquency, school programs, and then there's this whole now reentry movement of talking about people coming out of jails and prisons and going back into society. How do we help them transition so that they can make a successful move back into mainstream society and not reoffend and find themselves back in jail? And this reentry movement is kind of grown out of the realization that many people have come to, that almost everybody in prison at some point is going to get out. Very few people serve life sentences as a percentage. So almost everybody in prison today is going to be back out in society at some point in the next, however many years. So this reentry movement is now starting to focus on how do we support these people as they come back into society, whether we think they deserve it or not. That's not really the issue. But how do we support these people so that they don't commit the same mistakes and find themselves right back in prison and costing us money again? One last note, it's interesting that control theory is focusing on juvenile delinquency, like social bond theory did, usually locate the control influences in outside factors, mostly the family and then the school and some other institutions. Theories that focus more on adult crime, which is, self-control theory really kind of looked at both juvenile delinquency and adult crime. It really spanned the lifespan. They put greater emphasis on inner controls, which is what this concept of self-control is all about. So there are some other kind of minor theories that the book talks about, like Cohen's social support theory and some others. Be familiar with all of those, know kind of what the general premises are. But these two theories that we've talked about here are really the main drivers of control theory and criminology today. And so you really do need to be very familiar with those. So that's it for now. If you have any questions, get in touch with me, and I will talk to you soon.